In his early 30s, Justin Alexander Shetler quit his job at a tech startup and set out on a global journey across the United States by motorcycle, then down to South America and on to the Philippines, Thailand, and Nepal in search of authentic experiences and meaningful encounters, while also documenting his travels on Instagram. His enigmatic character and magnetic personality gained him a devoted following who lived vicariously through his adventures. But the ever-restless explorer was driven to pursue ever greater challenges and greater risks in what had become a personal quest, his own hero's journey. In 2016, he made his way to the Parvati Valley, a remote and rugged corner of the Indian Himalayas steeped in mystical tradition, yet shrouded in darkness and danger. There he spent weeks studying under the guidance of a sadhu, an Indian holy man, living and meditating in a cave. At the end of August, accompanied by the sadhu, he set off on a spiritual journey to a holy lake, a journey from which he would never return. That is a summary of Lost in the Valley of Death, a story of obsession and danger in the Himalayas, by Harley Rustad. I knew Justin, the subject of the book, as an internet friend and someone I had interviewed, describing him in one article as the most interesting man on Instagram. We stayed in touch over the years, comparing notes on our adventures. He DM'd me photos from a tea house in India a few days before he disappeared. Like many who knew him, I did everything I could from the other side of the world to be helpful to those who were looking for him, calling in favors from contacts in the region. Unfortunately, he remains missing, presumed dead. I met Harley through his research on Justin. My line about the most interesting man on Instagram made it into his book. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghost writer. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Harley, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. Well, pleasure.
Well, I absolutely loved your book, and we could do a podcast that's just me praising this book and recommending it. But you and I got in touch, and it was one of those things where Justin had gone missing, and he's not someone I knew really well, but he was someone I was friendly with, and I thought he was a cool guy. And I hadn't thought about him in a long time, and then you messaged me. How did you first hear about him, and what made you decide to write this book?
Yeah, so I was really initially drawn to the place before the person. And I had spent a couple of years in India in total, both as a traveler and as a journalist. And it started in, August of 2008 on this basically year-long trip for me, 2008, 2009, where I traveled all around the country into Nepal, went to almost every state on the subcontinent, and one of those kind of classic post-undergraduate degrees, I'm going to head to India and, find some answers about where I'm going to go with my life. And I had heard about this place called the Parvati Valley. And I never went there on that trip, but I had heard about it through some guidebooks, but also through traveler stories and meeting people on the road who recommended it as this absolutely kind of staggeringly beautiful valley in the mountains that was both a destination for spiritual pilgrims, but also hikers and for people looking to kind of get away from the crowds and the heat of other parts of India. And so I was drawn to it for those reasons. And there's this road that leads to a path that leads to these holy hot springs. And it's a place where Shiva meditated for 3,000 years, according to legend. So this incredibly beautiful corner of the mountains, but was a place that also had this really dark history to it. And a place where dozens of tourists and travelers have mysteriously disappeared over the past couple decades, basically one every year. And each one of these stories was different. They all had kind of commonalities to them. this place, this real dark reputation, as I call it in the book, India's backpacker Bermuda Triangle, this place where people enter, on an adventure full of hope, full of ambition, and then basically vanish without a trace. So I'd known about this place way back in 2008. And when I returned in 2012, 2013 to work as a journalist there, based out of Delhi, a lot of my reporting was focusing on tourism, the tourist industry. People are drawn to the subcontinent in particular, what they hope to achieve there, and some of the conflicts that happen within the tourist industry in India. And I came back to Canada, started working at a magazine, and I kept reading, the Times of India newspaper, the Hindu, some magazines there online. And in the fall of 2016, I came across this really short article about the latest person to disappear in the Parvati Valley, and this man named Justin Shetler. So initially, my interest was piqued because it was the latest person, and there was all these questions. This was about a month after he'd been last seen, and there were all these questions. A family had gone there to search, and so I was initially kind of drawn into that. And as I started to dig into who this person was, this entire fascinating backstory of this person started to emerge. That really, really drew me in. And it was somebody who, yes, he had disappeared in this storied and complicated place, but had this compelling backstory, this contradictory backstory, of somebody who really challenged and pushed, and I think updated that classic adventure gone wrong story that we're all kind of familiar with. He was somebody who had been a trained and naturalist who had vanished in the wild. He was somebody who was, a very accomplished traveler and adventurer who was constantly seeking. And, he was somebody who was spiritual, but always questioning that, and someone never really satisfied with his place in the world and where he was going, and was constantly trying to understand his place on earth, really. And so he was just this character who not only had this fascinating narrative and this really troubling one at the end, but also this road, this path that I was just so curious to follow, of all those steps that he took that ended up in the Parvati Valley.
It's really funny you say that about him questioning his place in the world, because I can remember, like a lot of people, engaging with his Instagram content in a very aspirational way, where here's someone who's out there really doing it, and here I am questioning my place in the world. And
that was another one of the contrasts to his life. He was somebody who was both incredibly grounded, with 2 feet, solidly planted on the ground, in his connection with the natural world, in his understanding of the natural world. And yet he also lived this kind of twin parallel life as one of these early travel influencers, 2013, 2014, 2015, when he kind of was building up a following, was quite early for that cohort that we now kind of, there are thousands and thousands of them, and they've become this whole industry. That was a time when it was not being monetized, and these people were emerging and building up these followers and not really knowing what to do with that. And so he was getting attention that he didn't know what to do with, and really struggled with these 2 feet in these 2 different worlds. And I think that added this really compelling layer to his story that I was really interested in unpacking.
Now, and I if I were you, I would be sick of this analogy, but there's another, a couple decades, or I guess a decade, 2 decades before him, there's another kind of misadventuring young man icon who, not just his story kind of begs comparison to, but so does the book, in my opinion. And he himself made this analogy. So it isn't just an obvious comparison. I think for listeners at home, have probably already guessed we're talking about Chris McCandless, the of Into the Wild fame. And I guess it's not just the going missing where I think there's a clear analogy, because obviously this is a comparison. The Alexander middle name, Justin borrowed that from Alexander Supertramp, Chris McCandless's alter ego. But it seems to me that that duality and the otherwise very competent person who came to misadventure in a way that's maybe easy to criticize, but seems to contradict other times where he was very careful and very skilled. I don't know. It seems to be a very similar story.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, first off, it's really quite touching to be kind of mentioned in the same sentence as that book and as Jon Krakauer, obviously, as a book that I, read when I was young and had a big impact on me, first as just kind of a teenager, and then as someone who got into writing and I think what I appreciated most of that book was just in how Krakauer handled his subject. I think there's a tendency to lean into the sensational aspects of these stories, and to focus on kind of the more dramatic turns of events and to, I guess, really highlight what makes these stories almost kind of like made for TV in a way. And I think what Krakauer did was he was skeptical. He critiqued when he needed to critique. He questioned when he needed to question. And kind of McCandless almost kind of build himself up within those pages and do the critiquing himself in a way. And I think that was something I kept in mind with Justin too, as somebody who, as you mentioned, on the surface can be quite easy to write off. You go to his Instagram and there's a bunch of pictures of him, posing shirtless on the top of a mountain. And he, definitely had a flair for the cliche travel quote and things like that. But I think my goal with this book, of course, it was to solve this mystery of what actually happened in the Parvati Valley on this final pilgrimage with this holy man up to this holy lake. What actually happened in those final days that led to the disappearance. But I think what I realized is that what really lasts, and I think what makes Into the Wild endure, is that it represents something bigger than just that tragedy, and just that in his case not a disappearance, but that tragedy. And it asks larger questions about how we move through this world. What values do we place on certain things, and how far are we willing to go to I don't love the word kind of authentic self, but how far do we want to go to feel fulfilled in our steps? And I think that's something that I really wanted to focus on was Justin's motivations and all of the different things that pushed him and propelled him, and to try to extract a kind of universality to his movements and to his life. And I think some of them are really subtle, and I think some of them are really profound. He was somebody who was really perennially unsatisfied with the answers that he was finding to some of the biggest questions about life and about spirituality and about relationships and about connections. And every step that he took along his path from the very beginning of his life to the very end, it felt like it was always attached with where is this leading me? Where is this going? And so while there are some really compelling narratives, and with McCandless, there was this story once he kind of gave away his money and hit the road and really disappeared until he was found. And with Justin's story, there's this really compelling narrative of his life that's in both cases filled with its own kinds of tragedy and pain, but also incredible adventure.
Okay.
Also had this really fascinating undercurrent. And I think in Justin's case, there are parallels, of course, but I think why I was drawn to this story in particular was that it represented, in a way, a kind of first century update to this classic tale. And so I don't mind the connection. And as you said, Justin's middle name was Alexander, and at a certain point in his life, he dropped his last name and just went by Justin Alexander. In a way, a kind of nod to somebody who he admired. And I think he admired McCandless because he was willing to go very far for what he believed in. And I think there are similar lessons that can be drawn from both figures. And of course, similar concerns and similar critiques.
Right. And I want to get to the critiques in a minute, but it's funny you mentioned connecting with Into the Wild as a teenager. I had the same experience, and I think we're probably around the same age. And I think for a lot of writers in our generation, especially of nonfiction, it was like Krakauer and Sebastian Junger. And when I look at what The Perfect Storm and Into the Wild have in common, it's that writing narrative nonfiction around a story where some of the most important details are never going to be known. I think it's really incredible the way in The Perfect Storm he writes about people where they were on a boat that sank and they survived, and so they can tell you what it's like to go down on a sinking boat and things like that. But I'm wondering about the storytelling mechanics and the research and the journalism there. Like, what's that like, and how did you approach, like, knowing you actually aren't going to get some of the, like, the reason you're even going there is because the answers are not readily available.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I think it's always a challenge. But I think the kind of the first challenge when approaching a subject like this is the first step is kind of recognizing what kind of trail as a writer are you about to follow. And because everyone is slightly different, everyone has slightly different, it's a slightly different pathway with different obstacles and different challenges and different breadcrumbs. And I think, for Sebastian Junger, he did have witnesses that he could, firsthand accounts he could interview that offer that kind of backbone to the story. And Krakauer had, obviously these letters, these postcards that McCandless kind of sprinkled and passed around and mailed throughout his life, or throughout the last year that offered a window into his movements, into some of his thoughts that Krakauer leaned on quite heavily to kind of reconstruct his life. And I think for Justin, as somebody who lived so deeply online, there was this incredibly rich trail to follow of photographs, of videos, each one that had a timestamp, a location, captions. For a journalist, for someone who's trying to reconstruct a timeline, really, to start with, it was just this bounty of information that I had at my fingertips. There were hundreds of social media posts, comments that he made on other people's, posts or pictures or musings or what have you, that offered this window into some of his perspectives on different things. And, so a lot of my job kind of became reconstructing that path as it kind of flowed around the world, and then starting to pin people onto that path. And what I started to do is really mine his social media, not just for the obvious, but for the people who were constantly commenting on his posts or what they were saying within these comments of, it was great to hang out in Varanasi last week, Then I would contact that person and interview them. And I found dozens and dozens and dozens of people that way, and reached out to them and interviewed them, and ended up basically interviewing a couple hundred people, some of who I just found through social media, who offered this. Yes, it might have been kind of a fragment, a fleeting experience with him that might have lasted a week or a 2-week period or something along the road. But, the really valuable ones became these really important puzzle pieces that I kind of added to my collection. And then it was my job to kind of fit them all together. And so it was this real bounty, but it was also something that I recognized early on as being basically a inherently flawed one. Because, I'm not the first person to say this, but everything that gets posted online is, a shard of a mirror that is offering a tiny little bit of a reflection of reality. And so I couldn't trust the timestamps fully because obviously pictures can be posted much later. I couldn't really trust everything that was being said in captions because people leave out. They tell the most exciting story or the most exciting version of that story. And so I had to be very skeptical. I had to basically question everything. And there was one good example where Justin went to Nepal a few years before his last trip, and he hiked up to this really remote valley called the Mustang Valley, way up near the Tibetan border. And it's really hard to get there. Not a lot of people go there. They go to hike around Annapurna, they go to Everest Base Camp, they do smaller hikes. So he told this story online in some blog posts and social media posts about doing this solo trek up to the Mustang Valley and kind of sneaking in, I think was the language he used, which I thought was surprising because I know that you need permits to get there. It's very complicated. You need a guide by by rule of the government. And when I started digging around, I ended up interviewing the guy who went with Justin on this trek. They had permits. Justin was not on his own. And so it became this example of how I had to be very skeptical of everything I was reading online. But it also added this other, I think, really interesting layer to Justin's life, which was about the stories that we tell about our own lives. And this desire to build up, not necessarily build up a narrative, but to intentionally try to realize a legacy. And I think that was something that Justin really struggled with, was what kind of impact was he going to leave on the world? And what kind of legacy was he going to leave behind? And I think at times he got caught up in the myth-making of this character, that he had to do something incredible. He had to do something solo. He had to go, a permitted place by sneaking in, all to kind of build up and continue to feed his followers online. And so it became this interesting research question, but also I think this interesting element and thread for me to kind of pick apart through the book itself.
And I'm wondering, because I remember like when you and I talked, I think because I didn't have all that much to say. I had some brief exchanges with him over a pretty long period, and I just remember I think we talked about what I knew that was kind of journalistic relevance for maybe 5 minutes, and then we had a longer discussion of just like, wow, what an interesting guy he was.
Yeah.
But I remember at the end of that call, I asked you what you think happened, and I'm sure that's a question a lot of people ask you. And I have something a little more meta than that, and a little more about the process, and that is, when all the work is done and you've put the pieces together and you've told the best story you can, or the one that's kind of asking to be told in the material, is there a difference between what you think happened and what is in the book?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think it speaks to a lot of different factors. And as I said, I went into it trying to solve a mystery and trying to, I went to the Parvati Valley twice to report on the story, and I ended up interviewing some of the last people to see him alive. This group of trekkers who encountered him high up in the mountains near this holy lake, this like reclusive sadhu who saw Justin pass by his hut, and, in one of the more kind of random, strokes of luck as a reporter, meeting this buffalo shepherd who lives in this collection of huts along the route, who Justin actually stayed with on his way. And so I did basically about as much as I possibly can to try to piece together what happened in those final days, in that final week, up in a place where, kind of ironically, I guess you could say, had no cell service. And, for someone who could have posted and updated and let alone send out some kind of distress call, all of this happened in a place with very, very little and impossible connection. So there were obviously going to be limitations on what information I could uncover. And so I think I recognized early on what that limitation was. And I think tried to underscore the fact that I think Justin's life and my goal as a journalist in telling the fullest story possible, in a way, kind of mirrors life, that we all start with innumerable questions that we want to answer by the time our days are done. And we all are lucky if we can get to a handful of them or 50% of them or whatever number by the time we pass away. And so I think what I recognized is that I wanted to leave the reader in a way that mirrors life, and hopefully a satisfactory way, where there are some lingering questions at the end that Justin maybe didn't figure out and didn't find out exactly what he was looking for, never got those ultimate questions answered. And I wanted to kind of leave the reader with an opportunity to make up their own mind or have their own kind of best guesses with what exactly happened. Did tragedy befall him, or did he find exactly what he was looking for and is still out there living, in solitude in the mountains? In short, I didn't leave anything out of what I uncovered. Every piece of evidence, every breadcrumb that I found is in that book. And I think what's left is those best guesses about, a potential murderer or murderers, so potential motivations and, turns in the path that might have happened up there. And I think there's this layer of mist that exists in that valley that's metaphorical and literal. And I think there's the layers of mist that exist between a journalist and their subject. And I wanted to let that mist, if you can kind of let me go with this metaphor, let that mist kind of hang at the end of the book and have it be a bit like life, where when you turn that final page, there are some questions left unanswered. So I hope that it's in some ways satisfactory for the reader in the end. But I obviously can't put in what I don't know to be true. And so there was always going to be a bit of a limitation there.
Sure. Well, that is a gorgeous answer. The other side, when you had mentioned kind of criticism of McCandless and also of Justin, and I think one thing you did really well in your book is you definitely allowed space for all sorts of opinions, and Into the Wild, I think, does a very similar thing. That and that book, Krakauer's book, evoked it seems a very strong reaction from people one way or another, and I guess to this day apparently he gets letters that are critical of McCandless or of him for telling that story or bringing it to prominence. And I think one of the letters he got actually reopened the scientific side of what actually happened, and it's in the new edition of the book and whatnot. We're talking about Into the Wild now, but I'm wondering, when it comes to your story about Justin, did you get similar reactions? Did you have people who were kind of either mad at him, mad at you?
I mean, I get emails basically every week about the book, and I think McCandless evoked a very specific kind of response, which was people who admired him for following this path and for what he believed in and what he gave up in this pursuit. And I think the people who, obviously had strong feelings against him were people who thought he was naive and thought he was underprepared, and that we shouldn't necessarily write about, but kind of, valorize somebody for putting themselves in a situation where they, met with tragedy. It's almost kind of a similar criticism of people who climb mountains and then get to the top, find themselves in trouble and call for rescue. And, we hear this critique all the time of, well, why am I paying my tax dollars to send a helicopter when you're kind of chasing this folly up a mountain? And so the responses I get are really interesting. And I think there's some people who admire what Justin struggled with and I think both personally and kind of psychologically and spiritually. I think there are a lot of people that are sharing their similar, like a similar kind of angst and a similar question in their lives right now. And I think there's people that admire him for how far he pushed himself and how far he was able to kind of endure a lot of this really dark part, which I talk about in the book, of really dark chapter of Justin's young life, and how he moved through life with that kind of burning inside of him. And I think the people who, don't appreciate him, I think, are the people who write him off very quickly. And one interesting one is that I do get quite often is people who, call him financially privileged, even though he basically came from nothing. His family had very, very little growing up, and he basically made everything on his own. But I think the one that is really interesting is him as this social media influencer, and people looking back at it with, the eyes of 2022 when the book came out, or 2023 or 2024, and not recognizing that this was kind of an emerging thing that he was struggling with and he was thrown into. And it was like he'd got on this train and had no idea where he was going. And they sort of critique him for, I think, the same reasons why they're frustrated with themselves. This is my theory. And it's kind of like buried in all these emails, is that I don't love how I represent myself on social media as a writer, as a person. I found the whole thing very uncomfortable. And I think a lot of people do too, but they also want to believe that, well, I'm the honest one. I'm actually telling my truthful, I'm using air quotes here, which don't really work on a podcast, but my authentic story on Instagram or what have you. And that they're kind of the exception to this truth that we all know. And so I think what Justin's story does in that way is hold, a hard mirror to look at back up at you, and makes you question whether or not what you're actually doing in leading these two separate lives, and how you're representing yourself, and where the truth lies. And so that's been a really interesting critique that I get a lot of him, and quite a lot reading between the lines in some of those emails. And so I guess I wouldn't say that I probably haven't received maybe the vitriol that Krakauer has for McCandless, because I know that's been a lot over the years. But there's definitely been some letters of people who just question why a book would be written about somebody like this, and I think some of the critiques are fair comment to make, and I hope they read deeper, and I hope they look into what some of this story represents and speaks to a bigger picture.
It's an incredible book. I recommend widely. And who wrote it was on this podcast. But it's called "Where the Mountain Casts Its Shadow" by Maria Coffey.
Mm-hmm. I know Maria well.
I was going to say, you two, I think, have been to some of the same book festivals, and and she lives in British Columbia, right?
Yeah.
But, I remember reading that book ahead of a pretty big sea kayaking project I was preparing for, because I wanted to take a really honest look at the way that if something happened, like what I could be doing to the people who love me. And I went into it, I didn't have a lot of context, and I was prepared for kind of that harangue about climbing being selfish, and it ended up being like one of the most life-affirming books I've ever read, without being, it wasn't naive. I mean, I thought she did an amazing job depicting the people for whom it isn't worth it. And because it's there is not a valid excuse for the absence of a parent or a loved one. But I think it's something she and I talked about, and I think you're exactly right. What does that say about the person who feels the need to, first of all, why do you even have an opinion about high altitude mountaineering if you're just a layperson down but I think at a deeper level, we don't call someone selfish when they die of a heart attack because of a egregious failure of work-life balance where all they're doing is being the life support system for a paycheck and eating badly and all these other kind of very selfish acts that people never ask them to make. But for some reason we put those things into different categories. And
well, I think the thing is that everybody inherently lives some kind of contradictory life, and we all have these forces kind of swirling around our head, and selfishness is one of them. It is a very, very common thing that it's not just the mountain climbers, it's not just the people who sail across the world and get into a whole mess of trouble who are just the selfish ones, and is an incredibly universal, sentiment and emotion, and we all possess it. And we all possess a little bit of ego, and we all possess, a heck of a lot of juxtaposition within our personalities and within our lifestyles and within everything. And I think that's where some of these figures, perhaps that get that have books written about them, open themselves up to this kind of natural critique, is that what's really happening feels a bit like that person represents something in us that we don't 100% love, and that we recognize is in our personality or is in our day-to-day life that we're frustrated by and we're not super proud of. And so I get those types of comments where, I would love to speak to them and kind of dig into it a bit deeper, and is like, what's really at the heart of this? And I think, this is what really drew me to Justin's story, is that I wanted people to react this way. If I wrote a book and nobody wrote me and nobody was connected with it or had feelings about the story, I would have been a little bit more disappointed than the fact that I get emails all the time by people who have thoughts about him and about the book. And I think that's what you want when you go into these projects, and when you in some way pick these subjects, is you want somebody who not only has a story to tell, but is going to push readers and is going to, yes, take them on an adventure, or take them on a narrative, or take them through, up a mountain. But you also want them to be challenged. And, as much as Justin was somebody who pushed himself and sought that challenge, I think his story also does that to a reader. And hope people continue to email me their thoughts about this, because I want people to continue to resonate and continue to connect with his story, and to have strong feelings about who he was and what he represented, and what they might take from his story and, apply it to their own lives.
There's and I was just struggling to find, I found it here now. There's a quote, because I think the one thing that people often miss when they see someone, especially the performative side of someone having adventures, and that duality you speak of, is the way that sometimes internally it can feel like that person doesn't have a choice. And the best depiction of it I've seen in fiction would be Solo Faces by James Salter, which, if you haven't read it, it is, and it's apparently based on a real American climber who took part in a famous rescue in France and enjoyed that weird sort of French celebrity status, and was like wined and dined and didn't cope with it well. Anyway, it's a great book, but there's this line in there. He stood at society's edge, envying its light and warmth, wanting to be part of it, determined not to be.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's lovely, and I think it's something that, is so universal. Even if we don't necessarily realize it, that we all want this deep connection. We all want, in some way, some kind of recognition for the work we do, or, whether that's parenting or actual work for pay. We all want to leave some kind of mark on this world. And And I think the question is how we go about that, our intentions, our motivations, and what does that actually serve? Is it all just for money and for fame and to be the person to climb the tallest mountain, the fastest, the first, the youngest, what have you? Or do we do it for something bigger because it really fulfills us? And I think a lot of these types of people are often tried, people try to kind of cut them down a bit because they are seen to only do it for that fame, for only do it for that reason. And I think one of the questions that Justin went into the Parvati Valley with in those final weeks, and I know based on the reporting I've done and believe that he was trying to answer there, was what was this all for? Was this all to build up an image and a name online and something that he could potentially monetize and turn into a career? Or was this something that truly inspired him and truly fulfilled him personally? Who knows what would have happened if Justin had made it out and, plugged his phone back in, if he would have, posted this incredible story, exaggerated maybe in parts, but sensational, or if he would have just deleted his Instagram account and kept walking out of the valley. We don't know. But I think that's what he went into it. That question was really kind of burning as he started that journey.
I want to shift gears a little bit and kind of wrap up with some, and I will have to have another conversation another day about India syndrome, and people who want to learn about that can read your book. I thought that was fascinating. I wanted to kind of wrap up with some sort of practical advice for someone who wants to write about a great trip or an adventure, or even just a period in their life that stands out. And I remember, I'm blanking on the name of the book now, but there's a guy who's like won the Moth storytelling competition a bunch of times, and he wrote a book about how to tell a great story. And one of his golden rules is like no drinking stories, no travel stories. And what he means by that is like if what the story is about is like then I got drunk, or if what the story is about is like I too have been to Venice, that's not a story. That's just like noise, and most people don't want to hear it. On the other hand, if you're on your trip to Venice, you realize that you're going to be in your kid's life because your parents weren't in yours, or you've decided that like something monumental has happened internally, then sure, like Venice could be the backdrop to that, right? Is basically his premise. But I'm wondering, like, how do I find the story in a trip or an adventure or an experience in the outdoors? And how do I maybe move past just the stupefying beauty of it all, or the way it moved me emotionally, but where's the narrative then?
Yeah. I mean, I think that the thing for me to keep in mind is that, a story of a trip is basically just, drawing a line on a piece of paper. And it's like looking at a map and tracing your finger and trying to describe that line. It's basically as superficial as that. And, without topography, without any kind of detail, without any reason, it's just tracing a line on a map. And I think the challenge is to recognize that the trip is only the reason why you may be there. And it's only the path, that there is the forest that you're walking through. I'm talking in metaphors here. There's the sky, there's the ground, there's the texture, there's the feeling, there's the reason, there's the goal, there's the hope, the aspiration, the conflict, the issue, all of these other forces that add texture and add detail to this line on the map. And once you start to kind of recognize those forces, within those becomes the story. And I work at a magazine. I get pitched all the time about stories, and for magazine features. And often people have a really interesting tale to tell, but there's no issue there. There's nothing that's propelling that story. There's no reason for the reader to keep reading. And what they really have is, a blog post about their travels, or an email back to fams. And I think the biggest thing is starting to tune your brain to see issue and to recognize that in any trip, and I mean going to the grocery store to pick up milk and traveling to Nepal to hike to Everest Base Camp, within both of those journeys are incredible stories to be told. And people think you have to buy $1,000 plane ticket and pack a bag and go on some crazy adventure to write an incredibly moving story. And yet some of the best pieces of travel writing did not go that far from home. And, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, Annie Dillard, that's an incredible piece of travel writing that really isn't travel writing at all, but I would consider it that. Jan Morris, who hated the term travel writing, is one of my favorite writers. She traveled a ton. Some of her most wonderful writing is about Wales, where she lived, and really not far from home. And so I think it's recognizing that there are stories everywhere, but that the path isn't enough. It's nothing, basically. There has to be the reason why you took this journey. There has to be some kind of goal, some kind of conflict, some kind of issue that you can bring to life that you think is going to connect with people. And it's going to touch on not just one, but several different emotions. And I think once it's a kind of like a pair of glasses that you almost put on, and without them, your head's down and you're hiking and you're walking along that path and you're not seeing it. And you put those glasses on, and all of a sudden you're starting to see that the person walking next to you represents something, that your heart and why you bought this ticket or why you stepped out your door represents something, that what you're hoping to achieve is in conflict with who you are, or is at the end of this kind of rainbow is going to be something either extraordinary or or completely banal, and in that is a really, really fascinating thread to pull on. So I think it's in part recognizing that the trip is nothing. It's all about how you perceive it, the reasons why you embarked on it, the people that you're surrounded by, and finding those issues within the path itself. And so I think it's a suggestion. It's try to find those glasses and try to wear them when you go on these trips, and to think about the trip as literally just, that line on a map, and that it's your job to really see it, because it doesn't come unless you are really seeing it.
It's in the same region as your book, roughly, but the snow leopard seems to do that in such a magnificent way, where it isn't. It ends up, the whole point is that it's not what it's about. Like it's not about the thing that it purports to be about, the conflict is stuff that's going on in his head, and that he has waiting for him when he gets back to Manhattan. And
and there's so many wonderful books. I think everyone always says, well, kind of read your genre, read widely, and read the kinds of books that you may want to write. But I think it's more than, in the same way that it's not just walking that path, it's not just reading. I think it's also reading and analyzing and questioning why they chose this and why they told this story in this way and what structure did they use, and how they gathered the information. That all kind of gives you, in some ways, a roadmap to follow, particularly for emerging writers. And I do this all the time when I read books, is look at the mechanics and look at the structure and look at how people have compiled their evidence, how they presented it, and almost in a way to kind of, visualize their corkboard or visualize their visualize their notes to try to replicate something in a similar way. But of course, recognizing that your own story has its own qualities to it, and it has its own specificity that that leads me to believing that kind of every story has its one perfect way of telling it, and you just kind of hope to get as close as you can to that.
Well, Harley, you've certainly written the kind of book I like to read, so I appreciate you for having put another great book out in the world.
Thanks. Yeah, that really means a lot. Especially somebody who knew him, who knew Justin, and it was a real pleasure to speak with you a few years ago in the research phase of the book, and so it does feel kind of like coming full circle. So it's been a real pleasure.
Likewise, yeah. Well, thanks again for taking the time to chat with me. What are you working on now, and where can listeners find you?
They can find me online through the usual channels, my website and social media and stuff. But I have a bunch of projects on the go, probably too many of various kind of sizes. And one I'm very excited about, but I don't know how far it's going to take me. And I think a lot of the things I really am drawn to, I like to read, and what I like to write is about our kind of complicated relationship with the natural world. And my first book was about that. I think my second book had this book that we've been talking about has a lot of that in it. And what I'm hoping for with the next one is a bit like that as well. So maybe I'll just say stay tuned, if I can say that, because I don't like talking about things before they're real. But yeah, there's a few things I'm quite excited about coming up, hopefully.
Brilliant. Well, I'll be staying tuned for sure. Thanks again, Harley.
Thanks, Harley.
If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Harley's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.